Hi everybody, my name is Ayelet Connell and this is an episode of Simply Paleo. And today we are going to make a double layer chocolate cake with a really decadent chocolate frosting. It is by far my favorite dessert and it took years to figure out this recipe and still create this very moist chocolate cake with this very rich chocolate frosting, but not have it be overpoweringly icky sweet like so often cakes are, and also have it be paleo. So for those of you that are just tuning in and are fresh to the paleo diet, essentially that means no grain. So how do you bake without grain? No gluten-free grains either. No rice, no corn, no millet, no amaranth, no wheat flour. So what we do is we look for flours that are either nut-based or root vegetable-based. And in my world of paleo, we don't do a lot of nuts because there's nut sensitivities in my family. So I had to keep working and trying out this recipe, and I found a perfect base that I use in a lot of my different baked goods with a little adaptation to make it large enough to fit in a cake tin and also have it be chocolate. So let's get started, and if you tune into my website, and there should be a link added on to the post attached to this Facebook Live that'll bring you to the recipe on my blog on simplypaleo.com. So we're going to be baking a chocolate cake. The first step is to preheat the oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit, and also to take a cake tin and to grease it. So you can use lots of different things, but in the paleo diet, we generally avoid dairy. So you can certainly use ghee, which is a casein-free form of butter. But what I like to do is just use olive oil because I use it in pretty much everything else that I make in the kitchen. So what I do is I just use a spray olive oil and I spray the cake tin, and I use literally a paper towel, and I just grease the bottom and the sides and make sure there's no pools of olive oil. And then I set it aside because we have to make the batter to be able to pour into the cake tin. So what we're going to do is grab a big bowl. Give me a quick sec. I'm talking. I need a bowl. Yes. Okay. These whole Facebook Live videos are always funny. This was the take two. So now we have a big bowl. I would normally use the KitchenAid mixer, but today we're going to be making the batter and also the frosting, and I don't want to have to stop the video to go wash out the basin of the KitchenAid mixer for the frosting. So we're going to leave this for the frosting when you're going to use a bowl for the mix. And I think that's helpful because it shows you how easy it is to make if you don't have a mixer. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with 1 1/8 cup of cassava flour. Now cassava flour, as I was saying, is a type of gluten-free but also grain-free flour that's made out of a root vegetable called the cassava root. Now some of you might not be familiar with cassava root as a name, but you're probably familiar with tapioca root. And it's actually the same thing. Cassava root and tapioca root are the same thing. Typically in baking, we see the ingredient tapioca starch, particularly in gluten-free ingredients. Well, tapioca starch is the starch of the cassava root, and cassava flour is essentially the flour of the whole root. So that's what we have here, 1 1/8 cup. And then we're going to put in some tapioca starch, which is, again, still from the same root vegetable, but it's just the starch, which helps to create the right consistency of the batter. So we've got 1/2 cup of tapioca starch. This is getting to be a pretty funny video, all the bloopers. And we've also got 1/2 cup of arrowroot powder. Now arrowroot is also a root, and you can also substitute this with potato starch, but I know some people that are doing more the autoimmune paleo, they're avoiding the nightshade vegetables, which white potato is part of. So we've got 1/2 cup of arrowroot powder. All right. And then we've got 3/4 cup of ground flax seeds. Now you can buy flax seeds already ground up, or you can make them yourself, which I love to do because then it's very fresh and you get all the freshness of the flax oil, which is not so stable if it's, out for a long time, but certainly the ground flax seeds are a great resource and save a lot of time. So we've got 3/4 cups of ground flax, and then we've got cocoa powder. Now, cocoa powder, we want to find a cocoa powder that's unsweetened, doesn't have a lot of fillers, things of that nature. So this cocoa powder that I'm using is from a company called Navitas, which I really like because it's very fine and I trust that it's coming from a clean source. But what I like to do with cocoa powder is use a sieve or a colander of sorts because it can clump and then make the cake a little bit clumpy in texture. So what I do is I take this half a cup of cocoa powder and I put it into this colander. And I literally just use a kitchen spoon and I'm just going to push it through the small holes. Now you can use a colander that's a little bit bigger holes and you'll get the same effect, it just won't be as fine. And this just helps to keep it from clumping. And you can just smell the cocoa, or I can smell the cocoa, and I'll tell you about it. You can live vicariously through me until you try this out in your own kitchen. And we're just going to get it to come through. It's really simple and it's pretty quick. And that's it for the cocoa powder. And then the last dry ingredients are for the baking purposes. We've got a half a teaspoon of sea salt in here. We also have a tablespoon or 3 teaspoons of baking powder to help it become more voluminous. And we've got 1.5 teaspoons usually of baking soda, and that's what the recipe says. But in this particular batch, I'm going to actually substitute the eggs out with chia seed. For those people that are trying to be egg-free, I just want to show you how to make the batter with the chia seeds. So when you do that, what happens when you avoid the eggs in a recipe is the recipe, when it's done, tends to be a little bit more dense. So what I like to do is put a little extra baking soda in it to help it rise a little bit more. So when you're avoiding eggs, what I like to do is use 2 teaspoons of baking soda. But generally, if you've got the 2 eggs in the recipe, then, or the 3 eggs in the recipe, sorry, for this recipe, then you would just use 1.5 teaspoons of baking soda. So we've got those 3 ingredients in here. And what we're going to do is we're going to mix it up. And it's pretty simple. If we were using the KitchenAid, we would just put it on low, slow, because otherwise you're going to get these ingredients all over your kitchen. And partly it's not, you know, you've got maybe the little bit heavierness of the cocoa powder and the cassava flour, but the starches, like the tapioca starch and the arrowroot powder, which is very, very fine, can tend to go all over the place. So you want to do a pretty good job of mixing it, and you're going to find that it's going to have a light brown tint, but not to worry. When we put the liquids in, it's going to get that dark chocolate coloring, and it's going to have a nice flavor to it from the sweetening that we add, from the natural sweetening of the maple syrup. I typically like to use maple syrup when I sweeten in baking goods because I find that it doesn't really impart a mapley flavor, particularly when you add the vanilla extract and cocoa powder and all these other elements to the recipe. And it's just a really easy sweetener to use, and I like it because it has a lot of nutritional benefits. If you're getting real pure maple syrup, then it has a lot of wonderful minerals to it. Now, if you are dealing with blood sugar issues or pre-diabetes, diabetes, and you obviously want to monitor things that are higher glycemic that can spike your blood sugar more. So in that sense, you might cut the sweetener down. And remember, when you reduce a liquid in a recipe, you want to then increase liquid in another part of it. So you might add more of the milk substitute that we're going to be using. So I'm going to put this aside, and I'm going to start to create the liquid ingredients. Now, this recipe is pretty simple in the sense that we create all of the dry ingredient mixture in one bowl, and then we do all the liquid ingredient in another bowl, and then we pour the liquid into the dry, we mix it up, and the batter is done. It's nice and simple. So in this mixing bowl, I have 3/4 cup of olive oil. And, you know, I tend to save my higher quality olive oil for things where the flavor of the olive oil is going to come through. So, for example, a pesto or something of that nature. But in this case, I just get, you know, extra virgin olive oil from Trader Joe's, and that's what I use. And I pretty much trust their sourcing. So normally I would put 3 eggs in here, but instead of that, we're going to do chia seeds. So I want to talk a little bit about how I created this very gelatinous mixture. So what you do when you're trying to have a substitute for eggs using chia seeds, and you can use whole or ground, but I used whole in this recipe, is you're going to take a tablespoon of chia seeds for 3 tablespoons of water. That's equivalent to 1 egg. So normally most of my recipes that aren't as large as a cake, so maybe muffins, I would do 2 eggs. So I would do 2 tablespoons of chia seeds and 6 tablespoons of water. I would mix it up, set it aside for about 15 minutes, maybe stir it once in the middle. And then you're going to get this gelatinous egg-like substance. Now, for this recipe, it calls for 3 eggs. I find that doing 3 egg substitute with chia seeds is a little bit much. It really affects the texture. So I'm sticking with 2, and it's still going to make a little bit more density for the cake. But again, we added a little bit more of the baking soda. But in typical recipe, you do 3/4 cup of olive oil. You're going to add in 3 eggs, and then on with our recipe, which we're going to talk about in a moment. So I'm going to put this gelatinous egg-like substance in here and set it aside. Okay, now we also want to have 3/4 cup of some type of a milk. Now, as paleo, we're generally dairy-free, so you certainly could use coconut milk as a substitute, but in my family we have some coconut sensitivities. So I typically use hemp milk, which is made out of hemp seeds, and I like it because it's a bit of a thicker consistency similar to a nut milk, and you can find it unsweetened, which is fantastic, and also unflavored. And they do have vanilla flavored ones, but in my baking I typically add vanilla extract, so I just use unsweetened, original flavored hemp milk, keep it in the fridge, and I use it for everything. So we're going to add the milk, 3/4 cups. And then we want to put in our sweetener, so we're going to use 1/2 cup of maple syrup. Okay. And then we're going to add in the vanilla extract. And for this recipe, I use 2 teaspoons of, actually 1.5 teaspoons of vanilla extract. I'm looking at the recipe here. Doesn't make a huge difference in flavor, the 1.5 versus 2. It just gives it a little bit more of that vanilla undertone. And then last wet ingredient, we're going to add in some applesauce. Now, the applesauce can definitely be changed out with a mashed banana, but sometimes I like the chocolate cake not to have a banana flavor to it, and the applesauce seems to not pull through as a flavor profile, but just gives a little bit of added a little bit of added moisture to the batter. So I get these squeezables. They're about 1/3 of a cup of applesauce. So you don't have to use this, but I find this is super easy. Of course, I have them as snacks for the kids, just these little organic applesauce mashups. So we're going to put about 1/3 of a cup of applesauce in, and then we're going to whisk. And we're going to find our whisk, which is, oh my goodness, we're really having all kinds. Oh no, here. It's in here already. That's ridiculous. There's a blooper for you. It's like having glasses on top of your head and saying, where are the glasses? We're leaving the car keys in the freezer. You're like, where are the car keys? So this does happen to us when we tend to reach the age of 40. And I don't think it has to do with any kind of neural degeneration. I think it's more just about life gets a little slower and we start to enjoy the scenery. And so that might cause us to maybe lower some things on the priority scale, like, for example, where's the whisk? So I'm whisking this up, and I'm making sure that I'm getting it nice and consistent. And sometimes the maple syrup sticks to the bottom, so you really got to do a good job of thoroughly mixing it up. And now what I'm going to do is make sure I added in all of my ingredients here, just checking my list. And now I'm going to pour the liquid into the dry and set my measuring bowl aside, and now I'm just going to mix it up. And you want to make sure that you mix it well and incorporate it. So start slow. Don't worry that there's clumps. That once it's entirely the same color, then the clumps start to dissipate as you keep stirring. So just take your time. Think of this as a relaxing exercise in mindfulness. And we're getting some nice, really beautiful chocolate smells here, and you can smell the vanilla undertones with the vanilla extract. Now, normally I would use the KitchenAid because I have a KitchenAid, and I just love to use the mixer. It really defines my kitchen, but you don't need to. You really can be fine just using a spatula or a wooden spoon, but just know it might be a little bit less smooth, but the end result is still going to be a delicious and decadent chocolate cake. Now, if you find for some reason that the batter is a little bit too thick, then you can add a little bit more hemp milk. And when you use the chia seeds, it can make it be a little bit thicker in consistency, but ultimately the cake is going to be delicious. All right, so we've got our cake batter. So now we're going to take our cake tin, and I'm going to switch out this wooden spoon for a rubber spatula, because I find that that's easier for getting all the bits out of the bowl. So we're just going to pour this into, hopefully without any bloopers, we're just going to pour it into our cake tin. And remember that we preheated the oven to 350 degrees, and now we're going to spread it out. Now, if you're using eggs instead of chia seeds, then you'll find that this really does pour and doesn't need to really be spread out, so to speak. But the benefits of using chia seeds is you can lick the spoon after, because there's no raw egg in it. Not that none of us have ever licked raw egg batter. Of course we have. So then what we're going to do is we're going to put this in the oven to 350 degrees, and we're going to bake it. Now, depending on the oven and whether you have convection or not, I typically start at 35 minutes, and then I pull it out and I check it. And you can do a toothpick test. I have this like long cake prong that I just stick into the middle of the cake and pull it out, and you're looking for it to be completely clean with no sticky batter on it. And if that's the case and it's smelling like it's not quite burnt, but it's very strong chocolate, then you're usually certain that it's ready. And if not, then you put it in there, not for 2 minutes, not for 5 minutes, really put it in for a good 7 to 10 minutes so that you're not constantly opening up the oven and checking. So that would go into the oven. Now, fortunately, I made this cake earlier. And so we're going to use the one that I made earlier so that we can make the frosting. Now, if you want to make a double layer cake, you're going to just double the recipe. But I really like doing them separately, each layer, because otherwise you might find that the proportion of what you put into each cake tin is going to be a little bit different. So I'll typically make one whole batter and then set it aside in the cake tin and make one whole other batter and set it aside. And that's what I did for today, for the batter, for the cakes that we're going to be frosting. But first we want to make the frosting. So let's get started. We're going to use the KitchenAid because you really do want a high-powered mixer to make this frosting. It's delicious. So we're going to start off with my favorite ingredient, which is maple cream. Now that's the base of this recipe. Maple cream is made entirely out of maple syrup. There's no other ingredients. However, the maple cream is whipped into a butter-like consistency. And you can find, absolutely delicious. You can find maple cream at some farmers markets, ones that have maple syrup stands that are local. But the easiest is just to find it on Amazon or some other type of website. Typically, I'll buy it in half-pound increments, because if it's only one layer of cake, then half-pound is sufficient. But if we're doing 2-layer, we're going to need a whole pound. So I just get a bunch of these half-pound ones. I leave them in the freezer. I typically order 4 or 5 at a time, because who knows when my kiddos and my husband and I want to make a emergency batch of cupcakes. So this is my base. And so I'm literally going to just get all of the maple cream from this container into the KitchenAid. And this is so decadent and so delicious, and definitely has a maple flavor on its own. But when you add in the cocoa powder and the vanilla and the milk and a little bit of dash of salt, then you're going to find that it has less of that. Okay, we're going to use one of these for my spoons. We're going to set this one aside, and then we're going to open up the other one, which I've already opened. It typically has a layering over it to keep it sealed, and so I've already torn that off. But I also know that it was fresh when I got it because it had that when I opened it. So I'm just going to get this in here. Now, I keep it in the freezer, so if I know I'm going to be making something, I take it out of the freezer for a couple hours. Maple syrup doesn't really freeze or crystallize, but it does get a little tougher in its maple cream consistency. So it just helps to have it be at room temperature so that it's easier to make into a frosting. But that's a note also that if once your cake is frosted and you're leaving it aside, you don't need to refrigerate it, because that might make the cake itself a little bit more dense. But You don't want it to be in a really hot environment because then the frosting is not quite going to melt, but it'll get a little bit runny and it might just look a little odd and still be just as delicious, but a little off-putting as far as how it looks. So we've got the maple cream in. Now the second ingredient that helps to give it that airy texture and that spreadable quality is shortening. Now, I like to use palm oil shortening, but thinking about all the world issues with palm trees and the orangutans, and there's some really serious issues. I like to use this company called Spectrum. It's an organic palm oil shortening. It's entirely made out of palm oil, but it's sustainable. And it has some wonderful elements to it. I mean, we know that it's GMO free. We know it's organic, it's fair trade certified, and it's Rainforest Alliance certified and certified sustainable palm. There's a lot of certifications that help me feel more confident that it's a better quality palm oil. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a cup of palm oil, okay, and I'm going to guesstimate it here, but you guys can definitely use a measuring cup because certainly the first couple of times, but you'll notice that this is somewhat a forgiving recipe. But if you put a little bit too much or a little bit less, it's still going to come out absolutely delicious. And the same goes for how much chocolate you add in. It just determines how chocolatey the flavor is. Okay, so we're going to set the palm oil shortening aside. And then we're going to put in our cocoa powder. So I've got 1/3 of a cup of cocoa powder to start with. Now with this recipe, what you find when you put it on the mixer on high, well, you start on slow so you don't get these ingredients all over your kitchen, and then you put it on high. And once you get to that glossy frosting texture, you can determine if it's too thick or too thin. And that's just as far as how easy it is to frost. These increments should be perfect, but there's always a chance that it's not, or maybe your measurements was off. So if you find that it's too thin, you can add more cocoa powder, but be sure to only do it 1 tablespoon at a time so that you don't overdo it. And if you find that it's too thick, you can add more milk, and you can also do that 1 tablespoon at a time. And we're going to use hemp milk again. So we're going to start with 1/3 of a cup. I'm not going to bother putting this through a sieve because it's with all these sticky ingredients that are going to get it to clump initially when you mix it, and then when you put it on high, it's going to get it to be really glossy and beautifully textured. And then we want to put in some milk. So we're going to start off with 1 tablespoon of hemp milk. And again, this is the unflavored and unsweetened. Now I'm just using a kitchen tablespoon, but absolutely you can measure the first few times until you feel comfortable with it. And then lastly, well, not lastly, second to lastly, we want to use some vanilla extract. So we're going to do 1 teaspoon of vanilla extract to give it that flavor that helps to mask a little bit of that mapley flavor so that it really becomes this chocolate flavor that's more overpowering. And then, of course, as a blooper, I left it over here, the sea salt. Whenever I do baking, and as most bakers know, a little bit of salt makes everything sweeter because it helps to make the flavors more robust. But particularly when you're using chocolate, it's always nice to add a little bit of salt because it helps to bring about more of that chocolate flavor as far as the robustness, but also it gives you a little bit of that salty aftertaste that makes a nice balance. But I only have sea salt at home. I have fine sea salt, and then I have more of the kind of crystals that I tend to use more Himalayan sea salt for. But this is just standard fine sea salt. I get it at Trader Joe's. They have it really at almost every conventional and natural supermarket nowadays. And I'm literally just going to take a pinch and sprinkle it in. And that's it. That's the sea salt, and that's all the ingredients. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this in my mixer. Just going to attach it. Forewarning, this is going to make some noise, this mixer. And I'm going to try to talk over it. So we're going to lift it up, and now we're going to start on slow because we want to incorporate the ingredients. So we're going to start on slow until it mixes in all the dry ingredients. And now I'm going to go on high. Maybe I won't try to talk. Hi. I'm going to turn it off and lower it so I can scrape off things off the paddle here, because sometimes you find that things stick to the paddle. This would work with the beater attachment, the whisk attachment as well, but I like these paddles because they have silicone on either side, so they really get to all the different parts of the bowl. And honestly, when I started using this, it was like a whole new world as far as making anything in the mixer. So I've scraped off the paddle, and now I'm going to lift it, and I'm going to turn it on again on high. My version of a power tool. It's looking amazing. It's smelling so good. Woo-hoo! As I was screaming before, this is my version of a power tool. The girls and their power tools, for me, it's in the kitchen. And it makes me very happy to play with it. So we've got our frosting. So what we're going to do is we are going to take our cake, our 2 layers of cake. We're going to start off with 1. So what I've done is I've taken a cake platter that you can see here, and I've lined it with parchment paper. Not one big sheet, but I've actually taken parchment and tore it in half and put one half under one half of the cake and the other under the other half, so that I can frost and not be so neat. And then I can just peel out the 2 parts of the parchment, and it still looks absolutely beautiful, and there's not chocolate all over the cake plate. So it makes it look a little bit more refined. And then, of course, I have my second layer of cake. Now, these were made with eggs. So you'll see this is sort of the layering that you have. Now, when you take this out of the oven, you're going to let it cool in the cake tin for a good amount of time. And then you're going to take some type of a silicone spatula, and you're going to just pry away all around between the cake and the tin, and try to kind of get under a little bit, but don't do it too forcefully. And then you're just going to put it right upside down over a cooling rack, and you're going to let it sit on the cooling rack until it's completely cool. Because if you try to frost the cake when it's still warm or hot, it's just going to be messy. It's going to get it all to melt and just be runny, and it's just not going to look the way you want. Frustrated. So really take the time and let it cool entirely. Now, if you make the cakes in advance, you can always wrap them up once they're fully cooled in saran wrap and just set them aside room temperature. And then the next day you can make the frosting like we're doing now, and then you can frost them and it should be fine. So this is my second layer. So what we're going to do is start just by taking the blade off, and we're going to scrape it off. Now, normally my daughter would be coming right up to me and saying, "Mommy, can I please lick the frosting off the spatula?" And of course it happens. I give her the entire thing. And my only rule is that she stays in the kitchen while she sucks all the chocolate off of this. But let me tell you, so delicious and really airy because of the added palm oil shortening. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a frosting blade, but you can also just use a kitchen knife. You can use a rubber spatula. You're going to see what works for you the best. And we're going to literally just put a layering over this. Now, if you find that you try this and you want it to be even more chocolatey, then you would just double the amount of cocoa powder or do a half a cup. And you might find you need to add a little bit more liquid. Okay. And we're just going to put a layering on top so that we can seal the 2 cakes. Okay. And then it also makes for a nice double layer cake look when you cut open into it. So you don't have to get too much onto the sides. You're really just doing a layer on top, and it just gives that added flavor. You don't want to use too much because you want to make sure you have enough frosting for the sides and the top of the other. Now we're going to take our second cake, and we're going to very carefully take it and put it on top. Make sure that it's nice and set. You can see what I'm doing here. All right, and now we're just going to go back to frosting top again, and then we're going to frost the sides. Okay, and if you find that some of the cake is kind of coming off, then just do thicker layers, but just keep in mind also that you want to make sure you have enough frosting for the sides of the cake. So there we go. We're just frosting away. This is kind of the fun part. And if you get any on your fingers, of course, you can lift the frosting off your fingers. Now, what I love about this cake is it's so festive, double layer chocolate cake. But if you're not needing anything so extravagant, then you can just do the one layer and make the same ratio for the frosting, and then of course you'll have extra frosting that everybody can take a spoon out of periodically out of the refrigerator and know that you're getting some good fats and some good minerals, albeit definitely high glycemic for the frosting, but has a lot of other properties that are wonderful. So now I'm going to start to do the sides, and it's literally, this is not really cake decorating 101. This is just common sense decorating. My husband took a cake decorating class over the summer at a store around us because he gets a lot of enjoyment out of making the flowers and all the other fun elements that can adorn a cake to make it, you know, more decorative. That is not my area of calling or passion. I love looking at cakes that are so beautiful, but it's just not an area of skill set for me. So what's fun is for birthdays, and it makes me feel so connected to my husband, I will bake the cake, and I will generally do this type of a traditional frosting, and then he will do the decorations. And he has tried lots of ways to make these decorations be sugar-free, and for the most part, he's managed to do it, except for those little flowers that require a lot of confectioner sugar. So sometimes what we'll do is we'll just limit how many of these little sugar flowers are on the cake, and we'll consider them more as decoration, although my kids do have sugar from time to time, there's no question. They are not paleo. They are gluten-free, and our whole household is gluten-free. My in-laws are gluten-free. I think I've done a lot of good education over the years with everybody. And for the most part, my kiddos are dairy-free. And then we just don't have refined sugars at home. And, you know, our dinners are paleo because I do most of the cooking at home, and I cook one meal for everybody, and they're delicious. But, you know, the food that they get out of the house, which is definitely gluten-free, might not be paleo. And I find that when someone has illness, it's supremely important to be really rigid with a diet. But otherwise, you know, there's a little bit more latitude in the choices that we make. And so for the kiddos, I also, and I know a lot of you moms and dads will understand there's a balance to be found when we make a lot of food restrictions on our kids and they're seeing other children eat in a different way. Hold on one sec, something's going on with the computer, so I just need to make sure it's working. Okay, and now we're going back to frosting our cake. So, you know, Halloween and things like that, there's lots of wonderful ideas for how to get your kids to have less sugar but still partake in all the fun. And, you know, one way, and this is what we did this year, is we gave them, you know, an allowance of a few pieces of candy that were gluten-free. Unfortunately, most Halloween candy is gluten-free and free of most allergens. So let's see, I'm just turning this around here. So it makes it a little harder to explain to the kids that are primarily gluten-free why they can't have candy. So what we do is we make an allowance of a few pieces over the course of a couple of days after and during Halloween. And then we take the bulk of the Halloween candy, and this year it was 20 pounds, which is a little insane. And we take it to the dentist, the pediatric dentist. Many of them, what they'll do is they will buy the candy. And our dentist, they'll do $1 a pound up to 5 pounds max for each kid. So that's $5. That's pretty good money to a little kid. And they'll send it to the military, who will then, and I think it's some type of a service, who will then give it to children in other parts of the world or the country, I guess. And I feel a little bit bad about that because, you know, it's not the greatest quality food to be donating, but it does give the kids an avenue to be able to partake in Halloween and then not eat all candy. And then, you know, other things that people have done that I've seen is they'll take the candy after all the Halloween festivities and they'll trade it for some type of a toy or, you know, a budget to go to the bookstore or something of that nature where they can use it to buy something that they really want, or maybe that they've been wanting for a while. Now, as you can see, I'm starting to run out of frosting, so I gotta be mindful of that, but I really don't have that much more left to frost. So this really is a perfect amount of frosting for a cake, but you just have to be judicious about it. And you can see I'm definitely frosting it so that you don't see the cake, but I'm not using such a huge lather that makes it be excessive. But if you really do like a cake that is very thickly frosted, then you can make a double batch of the frosting. Or you make this batch when you're just doing a single layer, and you'll have plenty. All right, now, here is our gorgeous cake, and it's just looking to die for. So we are going to cut into this cake, and let's see, this way there. So I'm going to take away the parchment paper so I can show you how it's done. You just kind of take it out from one end, almost like a clock. And if you're careful about it, the cake won't move too much. And we've got this beautiful, beautiful double layered chocolate frosted cake. And boy, is it gorgeous. So we are going to cut into this cake and we're going to try a piece. And there's different tools you can use. There are cake pie cutters that have a serrated edge. There's a bread knife. I actually like to use a bread knife. You know, when you're cutting into baked goods, having a serrated edge can be really helpful, hence the bread and the bread knife name, because it helps it to stay intact and not fall apart. So what I like to do is I like to cut the cake in half. Now, part of the reason of this is because then if we eat half the cake, the other half is not demolished yet and still looks somewhat pretty. But also then I have two options. Now I can go and cut it almost like pie pieces, or I can cut it straight. And depending on if this is for a party of lots of people and you're, you know, wanting to make sure you have enough pieces, you could also then cut again horizontally, parallel to the middle, and then you have even more pieces. But for this, we're going to do pie pieces. So I'm just going to use my bread knife to cut a hefty piece out. Did I mention that my birthday was this week? So this is kind of hence the reason why I made this cake, because this is a cake I made for myself on my birthday. And that might sound sad to some of you, but honestly, it was blissful to have a little bit of time alone in the kitchen making a cake and then to celebrate with my family with a dessert that I feel so good about. When I eat it, I don't feel bloated. I don't feel lethargic. And I just love every morsel. So why not make your own cake? So I've got myself a plate. And I'm going to use this pie cutter to pull this piece of cake out. Put it on its side. And we're going to move that piece out so you can kind of see the way it looks on the inside. Here is my cake that's been frosted. It's beautiful. And now I'm going to eat it. So let's give it a try, shall we? So we're going to take a piece with the frosting on both ends and the cake, and it is looking so moist. Oh my God. It's my birthday all over again. It's so good. Oh, delicious. I'm telling you, this is a very simple recipe. If you're a little overwhelmed by this, you can just start with a one layer, which is what the recipe is for, and then make the frosting, and you're just going to be so proud of yourself, and it'll be such a fun thing to have for your family. Remember that if you're egg-free, you can substitute the eggs with the chia seeds. It's just going to make it a little bit more dense, and make sure to up the baking soda just a touch. But otherwise, just stick to the recipe. It's going to make a delicious, moist cake you can use for birthdays, you can use for holidays, for Hanukkah, for Christmas, for Easter, for anything. And there will be some notes on the website to show you how to vary it to make different flavors. So it's not chocolate, maybe it's vanilla, maybe it has different coloring in the frosting. There's ways to modify it. But I hope you try this. And definitely stay tuned for more episodes of Simply Paleo with me. And as always, I'd love to hear from you. So you can put a note in this particular Facebook Live post, or you can email me at ayeletconnell@gmail.com, or just visit the website, simplypaleo.com. Then you can check out the blog. There's a ton of recipes with videos and posts and all kinds of lovely strategies for living paleo. So I hope you check it out, and thanks so much for joining.